really beautiful. And if you didn't have any other afternoon plans, then I'd recommend checking that out. To a regularly scheduled program.
Or, we're getting a little bit of a late start, 9:20, but we will go into the break, probably 15 minutes, and then we'll hope to just make up that time, maybe by lunch or final thoughts, or we'll just keep going, take this show to the garden. We have three Knox youngsters and vectors today. We'll do in the order that they are on the schedule, beginning with Melanie Sehgal. The history of the doctrine of matter has yet to be written on the matter of knowing.
Okay, thank you. So I did my homework and kind of really try to bring something that I'm thinking about and that I'm not quite sure about, or if it's an interesting knot or a relevant one. And so that's like the question I'd like to ask. You can use the brilliancy in the room to think with me. And so this knot vector, juncture, it's kind of hard to separate them somehow. It's concerned with the relation between the conception of knowing and the conception of matter. So I'd like to start us off, ask you to think about your first association with the term matter, just like the first one, and maybe just write it down, and we'll come back to it in the discussion, or not. Give you a second to do that. Just make a mental note. And maybe we could do the same thing with knowing. Or knowledge, if you prefer. Just what tone that kind of rings. So I'd just like to say a few words about where I'm coming from this. And so my starting point is Whitehead's reading of the modern constellation is marked by the bifurcation of nature, and its continued relevance for looking at knowledge production today. So this is, like as I said, it's not a fleshed out project that I've been working on, rather it's a lore that's been hovering in the background of a past project, let's say, or that might continue into something else. And I think it's the problem that Lord Whitehead into philosophy, so the kind of downfall of classical physics and what that actually means for the way that in which we know and which we produce knowledge. And so in a way you could say, okay, what I try to do is like look at this proposition or this problem that Whitehead kind of saw at the beginning of the century and ask if it's still relevant today. And so personally, I worked around this notion of the bifurcation of nature in the context of a book on William James and Whitehead. And there kind of looking more at the side of the bifurcation which concerns experience and subjectivity and kind of reworking those terms and seeing how can they be thought through without letting nature bifurcate. And so some are like, I'm tempted to look at the other side of the divide, so not experience, but nature or more specific matter. Because I think that the persistent power of a certain way of knowing, so it's not necessarily the science as a practice, but the image of science, or like science with a capital S, the power of that kind of knowing to explain other modes of knowledge as a way has something to do with a specific notion of matter. So the concept of matter, just to flesh that out a little bit, even if probably when people are familiar with this, as it was forged within classical Newtonian physics, plays a crucial role for the habit of thought that Whitehead terms the bifurcation of nature. So Whitehead traces the historical and systematic reason for the incoherence in the concept of nature to an implicit and unwarranted generalization of the Newtonian concept of matter. So the huge success of classical physics played a decisive role in establishing the practices of knowledge production in the modern science. And so then a modern notion of matter then largely and implicitly informs what it means to know in general, so beyond physics and the experimental sciences, because they precisely inform the practices of knowledge production, not only the specific theories. And I think Isabel Stenger's work on the experimental dispositive and kind of this primal scene she describes of Galileo kind of letting his balls roll down the inclined plane is a helpful way to think about like this very practical generalization of a Newtonian concept of matter. But this notion of matter was shattered at the beginning of the 20th century when notions of classical physics were put into question by the advent of relativity and quantum theory. And so this is what we all know that brings Whitehead to philosophy. I really love this quote where it says certitude was gone, and it's not only the certitude of the gravitational laws, but that this conception of knowledge that was bound to it. So really like the notion that knowledge could be something certain, that was gone. But nevertheless, as I hinted to, core assumptions of classical physics continue to inform what it means to know. Firstly, because they have continued to exist as sediment in the material discursive frameworks of knowledge production, but also because the habit of letting nature bifurcate prevents a feedback from physics back into the humanities and their epistemologies. So I'm wondering if this reading is still relevant for looking at the situation today. So my question is whether the repercussions of the downfall of classical physics for the humanities and knowledge production at large have actually been drawn, whether they've been followed up on, or whether there's still work to do. And so, yeah, my intuition is somewhat that there's still work to do, but I'm interested in hearing your opinion and in what direction this work should kind of take place. And I thought one way of reopening this feedback back from this kind of physical situation in physics back to a philosophical or humanities approach. I thought maybe one avenue to do that is to take this quote of the concept of nature, the history of the doctrine of matter has yet to be written, and to invite a kind of wider reading of that quote or that passage. Because Whitehead in that context refers to a critical history of the doctrine of matter as it has informed scientific materialism. So he proposes to look at the Greek roots of matter when thinking in terms of substance and quality, so challenging those modes of thought. And I wondered if we can read this proposition in a wider sense, so kind of inviting a counter-history of the doctrine of matter within recent Western history of inquiring into notions of matter and materiality. So in a way, looking at the limits of materialism as they surface within physics itself as a place of origin of scientific materialism. So findings that challenge materialism as a generalizable frame for reality as such. So the most obvious thing that comes to my mind is that current research on dark matter. So I think there's some expertise in the room to maybe share on that, but one thing that struck me is that there's the hypothesis that basically only 5% of matter in the universe is actually the type that we can explain within the Newtonian framework. So that there's really like this percentage kind of brings to mind that the generalization is really not warranted. And so the question is like, what repercussions does this have on our ways of knowing? Maybe to say, to conclude, two reasons why I'm interested, if it's not clear. I mean, I think one obvious kind of contemporary discursive context for this discussion is the widespread discussions around matter and materialism within new materialisms, and kind of coming from the bifurcation theory, like this discussion has been somehow confusing for me because matter is used here in a very large and broad sense, sort of like just skim some reading, and it's ranging from the body, the real, the concrete, artifacts, objects, things, life, immanence. And I was thinking, so what is it actually kind of referred to? And I think matter here, what kind of, even though I'm very sympathetic to the general line of thought, I find it confusing that matter is actually presented as a solution and not something that needs to be challenged, maybe. And then I thought that this, when I reread The Concept of Nature, the history of the doctrine of matter has yet to be written, I thought it was kind of an interesting challenge to presenting matter as a solution in that way. But more importantly, in my general concern, I've forced myself to spell this out a little bit, and despite the danger of being trivial, I think to understand the systematic and historically specific ways in which power is inherent to specific ways of knowledge production. So I'm like thinking here about the Foucauldian power knowledge equation, more like thinking about how we can combine historical and systematic constraints that enable a way of producing knowledge, to understand knowledge at large, to creating others into mere belief or art, subjectivity, the esoteric, the indigenous, you name it. So I think this interest in like combining a systematic as well as historical approach lies in the fact that there's a necessity to validate other forms of knowledge production, and that it's made clear in this context why this is desperately needed. I think some like the ways in which Western science has like drifted into politics and managed to explain other modes of knowledge away is clearly shown to be disastrous in some way. But I think that even though this necessity is quite clear, we haven't, maybe that's a subject to discussion, we haven't really found the means to really incorporate other forms of knowledge production, simply because simple inclusion will not work. It's like it's the structure of what it means to know at large that needs to be revisited, and of course there's been work done in that respect. That's Gallison's work on objectivity or Stenger's work. So I'm not quite sure if that's all solved or if there's still something to be done. But just to end, just want to sum that up. I think the conception of matter is so crucial for what it means to know, and if this conception of matter within physics has changed towards a more fluid, less certain, and more speculative form of matter, then a new dialogue with other nature cultures would become possible, maybe. So what I mean is, well, my question is, maybe it would become possible to truly work with and learn from other forms of knowledge production. So this already, I think, concerns the way that natural sciences and humanities can interact, but I'm mainly thinking of like bodily and spiritual knowledges and knowledges that are situated in other space-time configurations than modern science.
We have plenty of time for questions.
While you're speaking, I don't know if the neuroscientist is here today, I can't remember his name, but yeah, I was just while you were speaking, I was thinking of the ways in which physics is actually pierced through the other side of the classical theory of doctrine, where dark matter is actually there's more dark energy than dark matter. There's the ambiguity between matter and energy. There's no more simple location at the quantum level. There's vertical particles that pop in and out, so matter becomes in the void. So matter becomes in direct proximity to the virtual. So there's all of these ways in which it's been undermined from within. But it seems to me that, you might disagree, but it seems to me that the last refuge of that classical doctrine of matter is actually in neuroscience, with the in mainstream neuroscience, with the attempts to make neural correlates of consciousness, and then often to make consciousness simply an epiphenomenon or something that can be bracketed in a description of the movements of matter in the brain. So I just thought it's interesting that matter has moved on to the into the the region of thought and the seat of knowledge, more than the far reaches of the outside external world.
Can I? After that nice setup? Yeah, I agree with you that I think that Patricia and Paul Churchland were really integral in kind of forming this idea of a reductive neurophilosophy. But there's hope. And
there are other versions of it.
Yeah. I think a lot of that was predicated on the idea of a 1-3, so a first person, third person sort of bridging component to solve the problem of quality. But there's another way. And I think that I've been talking a lot about interoception over the last few days here. And I think there's another way if you recognize the role. There's a good lady named Nathalie Deplat. I think she's out of, I'm awful at French, but she's out of France. And she develops the role of the second person. I think that's perfect. because there she's talking about the second person as the interrelational. I'd like to say the interrelational and intra-relational. So then you have interoception. And I think if you take interoception as your second person, then you have this sort of quasi-Peircean kind of 1, 2, 3 notion of consciousness, and you're back into a really good realm. And instead of trying to go 1 to 3, you go 1, 2, 3. It's more logical.
Well, I think it's mainly in the way it's translated into the media and has its public presence that it falls back into this.
But then if
They're
it's
very
also
simplistic models.
I'm sorry, very simplistic models, and there is a way to nuance those and make them more understandable. I think we're going to find neuroscience becomes more about the individual, and it's going to connect to Eastern religions and everything. It's all going to be there. But I do teach neuroscience in the summers. My dissertation was actually on relativistic quantum field theory and looking at Verlinde's emergent gravity theory, which is a brand new. I mean, he published it in 2010. He just published his first follow-up paper about a week ago. And there he's got a theory for how dark energy, that there is no dark matter. He's found a way to do this all if we take an idea of emergent physics. And so to come back to what you were saying a little bit, it's funny that Whitehead, in his principle of relativity, actually sort of reversed Einstein's notion of taking two metrics and putting them together. And Whitehead actually said, well, no, we need to maintain the distinction between geometry and physics. So it's funny that Whitehead actually said that we have to pull apart the two metrics. And in order to develop an emergent theory of gravity, or for him a dual metric theory of gravity, he found that you need the two metrics separated from each other. But I think that in the long run, so but to take the moment real quick, I found a one-to-one correlation between Verlinde's work, his emergent gravity theory, and Whitehead's principle of relativity. A one-to-one correlation, where even the language is carried over. Step by step, it goes through, and I show A, B, C, D, E. Is what he did, they all link. So in other words, it appears that Whitehead might have the philosophical foundation for an emergent theory, or for emergent physics proper, because Verlinde's emergent gravity also incorporates emergent space-time, emergent quantum mechanics, emergent gravity, so they're all in emergent string theory. So they're all in there. And so I think there's a lot of potential. Science, the top scientists, even in neuroscience, there is an article, which is the last comment, but the computational neuroscientist over at UCL right now in London, Carl Friston, is incredible. And he's now making the shift. His newest paper is called Predictive Coding, a Process Theory. So it's like neuroscience is even, once we come into computational neuro, they're actually the ones who are going to be closest to what is happening here, which is so interesting. But computational neuro is the one they're doing.
I have two in the queue. Are either Catherine or Erin, are you on point, or are these new ideas?
I'm going to talk about neuroscience, so maybe you are too.
You were broader point.
Okay, we'll go on point here shortly, and then we'll go back to Catherine.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow this because I really share with you. Thank you for that. Fantastic, beautiful. And I really share with you the confusion that comes with new materialism. I think anytime I see new in front of something, I worry a little bit, because it's, it's not so new, right?
It's old.
Yeah, and then being jumbled into it, because suddenly you find out you're one of them, right? So that's also really weird when they quote you as one of them. Very strange. But I just wanted to come back to this question of matter, because I think I was sort of perplexed to be invited as a keynote to 2 neuroscience conferences in the last year. And I don't do any neuroscience at all. But I think you're right that there's an intuition, both of them were in France, and there's an intuition that there's another way of going into the question. But the problem, and this would lead back to science, I think, is with the experimental method. So what I'm understanding, and my link into neuroscience is both activist and philosophical, because I work so much with autism that it really does matter what kinds of limits are placed in society from the perspective of neuroscience on a whole slew of people who are then excluded from education and so on. And so about 10 years ago, there was the first neuroscientific paper that was published, not 10, maybe 5 years ago, in Frontiers of Neuroscience about autism being a movement spectrum disability rather than an intellectual disability. And work began to be done around movement, but the problem, as anybody who works in movement knows, is that it's very hard to use an experimental method to map a movement, because movement doesn't operate in the actual. I mean, you really need a Whiteheadian perspective, I think, to understand that movement moves through rather than is subjectively taken, a subject doing a movement. It's the other way around. And so to map movement onto a body is very, very difficult. And so it seems to me really interesting, this question that you're asking around matter and thinking. And I'll just give you one example. This was Amanda Baggs was in the laboratory at MIT. This is about 12 or 13 years ago. And one of the questions that has come up around autism is where language is. Because the classical autistics don't generally come to language until their teens. This is changing as modes of facilitation alter. But when they come to language through typing, they had language already. So what they say is, I already always had language, but I didn't have it until I could use it. And so they come into poetry. This is very, very interesting. So they don't come into prose. They come straight into a rhythmic language that is a kind of language of pure quality. And then they can learn to write prose, and they do. But there's one autistic, Lucy Blackman, who talks about carrying. So when she writes for herself, she puts carrying everywhere. I'm carrying to the conference, carrying to the feeling, carrying to the talking, carrying. And then when she writes for neurotypicals, she takes all the carryings out because she understands that neurotypicals don't want carrying everywhere. And so anyway, years ago, Amanda was in the MIT lab, and they were trying to trace where language was happening in her body, and she was totally frustrated because they were sitting her down and nothing was happening. And finally she pushed through, and she started moving. And then the language was being noticed in the brain, right? So the language centers were activated. But then the MIT neuroscientists said, we can't map this. It wasn't part of our experimental protocol. So the question of matter and thought seems so important in that regard.
I mean, I'm happy to have like a group discussion. I think that's fun, but I think like pointing out this problem of the experimental method is crucial. That's also why I make this reference to Galileo, where it kind of like reverberates or like corroborates that point.
Well, I just want to.
Actually, we have a queue here. So Catherine, Roland, and then back here.
You will intervene in this discussion.
If you have a very short on point,
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Melanie. Obviously, this discussion of matter really continues to matter. And I'm channeling already Karen Barad. So I think of her as perhaps the leading new materialist. And when she came to a conference we organized with her at Drew 3 years ago in the Transdisciplinary Theological Colloquium, I mean, she was expressing the same impatience about new material. So does William Connolly, so does Jane Bennett, right? I mean, so new materialism is just a phrase. It's not a method, and it's not a field that has allowed conversations to gather. I happen to think they're indispensable because I think Karen's work is crucial. Let me just read this for a definition of matter. And she doesn't get it from Whitehead. She's sympathetic. I mean, I think she can't do Whitehead because she's doing much too much already. And even now, connecting Derrida, connecting Judith Butler in through her intensive work with quantum mechanics as a physicist. But this, from our conference paper, hers. In an important sense, in a breathtakingly intimate sense, touching, sensing is what matter does, or rather, what matter is. Matter is condensations of responses, of responsibility. Each bit of matter is constituted in responsibility. Each is constituted as responsible for the other, as being in touch with the other. Matter is a matter of some intimacy, of cohabiting, of touching, of being in touch, of responses to yearning. Just a little development there of her understanding of matter as the mattering of our intra-active becomings.
I mean, for sure, Barad's work is really crucial in account that you thinking matter. I think I would like to, like, from there, and like she's been crucial in that, like, ask about the repercussions for the humanities. And I think like, about for the repercussions for the humanities and about how, I mean, I feel like there's often very like implicit idea of science in what we in our own practices, be they philosophical, historical, take as knowledge, and that matter kind of plays a role in there. So this is kind of where the knot lies. So it would be about bringing in Barad and the work that she does into that
I
discussion.
think she's in there already, because she makes herself so available. But yes, barely beginning to happen is what you say needs to happen.
We have 4 minutes left, and Roland, and then Karen.
Yeah, so I think these chapters are very fascinating of concept of nature, first two that you engaged with. And I think it's true. It's really the mode of production defines what you get. And this is almost like an epistemological formulation of the process principle, right? How it becomes is what it will be. And that's kind of in quantum physics, it became a basic principle, right? So the way you look at it is kind of what you get. So the method of production. And what is interesting for me, and there's maybe the connection also to new materialism or call it like more sensitive materialism, is that I think Whitehead's notion changed over time regarding bifurcation of nature. I think if you read closely in the concept of nature, it's different from later on. So we think of it as the kind of bifurcation between mind and matter, or nature and mind. But I think in this earlier writing, he was making a different point, namely the bifurcation arises if you wrongly introduce mind into nature. So it's a different way to look at it. So what he defined as nature, was perceptive nature. The percipient perceptive event, right? And perception was part of nature. So there is the sensitivity of connectivity going on. But what happens if you introduce wrongly with the method mind is that you change the kind of the relationality, what he calls the factors of a fact of nature, into a substance, in an abstraction that is created by the mind. And therefore then what happens is here an early example of what he later calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, namely that you then take this abstraction of a thing, because that mind makes a thing out of factors of a fact, and pose it as the ground of everything, right? And that's the notion of matter that he kind of criticizes. So sensitive materialism, I think.
Beautiful.
Here?
Just two comments. So one thing is I think, Melanie, that was great. Thank you. And I'm really, and I'm not really trying to be snarky, but I think that, and I'm glad that Catherine read that text from Karen Barad, because actually what it does for me is confirm why I don't like it so much. And I really don't like the tone. One of the tones that matter is. The way the description of matter is, because what I hear you doing is actually problematizing matter, right? And it doesn't seem to me that Barad is necessarily problematizing matter in the same way that you are, and that's one of the things that, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There's an affirmative, there's a description of what matter is, right? Mm-hmm. Matter, and it sounds a lot like maybe concern in Whitehead or something, right? I mean, it's interacting, it's mingling with bodies and so forth, right? But at the same time, I feel what's powerful about what you're suggesting is that we need to actually be problematizing this question of matter, right? And why it might matter, for example. The other thing I was going to just say, that the second thing is that my initial comment was about the experimentation. And I wonder if the experiment isn't the problem, it's actually what we're demanding of our experiments that might be the problem, right? That we're asking the wrong questions of our experiments, and we need it to answer these sorts of things when the actual problem is of the experiment itself.
For the sake of time, Brian, if you'd give your comment, and then we'll have a word.
Unless there's someone else to say.
Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I really liked the broad. And I think maybe one way of problematizing it is if matter is defined in those terms as kind of mutual sensitivity with sort of a connotation of some form of touch, then maybe a way of problematizing it is then to think of the mental pole as opposed to the mind as non-local liaisons, non-local linkages in a Bier's sense, so that in the interrelation of the two factors that you problematize, rather than squarely on the material side.
Rather than?
Squarely on the material side.
No, I just want to say thank you. I just meant to bring something to open up.
And our next speaker, the second of our morning, is Michael Halewood, who will be speaking on nature and society, or performing. I'm not sure what he'll be doing.
No,
He's dancing.
no.
Nature and society.
The performance is simply, I mean, when we were organising this, we were meant to suggest not having the usual academic papers. So what's going to be, I'm not going to do anything exciting. What is unusual is the fact that I'm going to be very honest. And I'm going to be honest about a problem which I have, and I really think this is a problem. Now, it might sound to start with that I'm being arrogant, but that's because I have to talk about what I've been doing to lead you into what I think the problem is. Thank you for bringing up, I've got a PowerPoint which I did before I came, and I can't remember what's on it. So we'll do some surprises maybe, but I'll just talk. It's mainly, there's a couple of quotations that I want you to be able to see. So we'll get to those. I'll see how much I can talk. Right, thank you for bringing up the bifurcation of nature. I'm going to give my answer, which is my problem at the start. I wasn't going to do this. I assume that we all vaguely know what the bifurcation of nature is, and that we should avoid letting nature bifurcate. I think actually it's really easy to not let nature bifurcate. In fact, it's too easy. I'll try and explain what I mean by that. That's my sort of proposition. Is actually, for me, it's become too easy, and that's the problem. Is I've learned a clever, knowing way of avoiding letting nature bifurcate, and if something's too easy, then it's a problem, and I need to be kicked and pushed out, and I need the problem to come back again. Okay, so a couple of years ago, I don't know if you know Didier Debez. He's a great Whiteheadian and nice guy. I was at a workshop he'd organised with his PhD student, Emmeline Theroux, and she gave a paper, and Didier took me aside afterwards, and he said, she was talking about societies in Whitehead, and he said, isn't that amazing? About 10 years ago, we didn't realise, or we weren't sure about how important societies were to Whitehead's philosophy, and we were talking about actual entities, natural occasions, etc., etc., not realising that actually the world that we encounter is all societies. And he said, do you remember like the work we had to go through to get to that position? And now we have these young new people coming through, and for them it's just as plain as day, you know. And so Stenger says in her book, in Thinking of Whitehead, you know, so everything is sociology. In that, what we're studying, what we encounter in the world at the human level, are societies. Now, my problem is my wages are paid by sociology department, so I feel I have to announce that and be honest about it. So I am interested in societies and the social, and what Whitehead means to it by these terms, and what he can do for sociology. So I have learned ways of saying, you know, societies are matters of, are things which endure and cohere and bring together that which was previously diverse, and it is an achievement which maintains itself over time by means of a mutual apprehension, etc. So I can sort of do it, and I've learnt it, and in a sense, for those of you who are interested in sociology, you might be thinking of Bruno Latour. Now, Bruno Latour, partly influenced by Whitehead, has developed a critique of the modern conception of nature and society, as saying that these are, because one of the things that Latour is wanting to challenge is the idea that societies, and by this I also mean culture, is separate from nature, and this is one way that things are bifurcated. So we have the social realm, the human realm of thinking, the human realm of culture, etc., which is somehow divorced from the odd scientific realm of matter, of things which can be absolutely known. Now, so Bruno Latour, in doing this, is critiquing the traditional sociological approach of people like Durkheim. Now, you might not be interested in Emile Durkheim, but I'm going to bring up why you might be more interested in Emile Durkheim than you think in a little bit. Because, hang on, have I got myself a bit lost, do you think, rather? No, okay, right. So, in a sense, so I agree with sorry? Am I always a bit lost?
No, it doesn't happen with anything.
Now, in a sense, Latour is right. But again, I think I've learned the vocabulary of Latour to get around certain problems. So I'll cut to the chase. Over the last 2 years, I've written 3 papers, which I quite like. So one was on commodities. So I went back to Capital, Volume 1, and reread the commodity as socio-natural in terms of exchange value and use value, because my suggestion was that we only ever think of commodities in terms of their exchange value, which is the social side of things, whereas Marx makes it quite clear that what's peculiar about commodities is that they have a dual character. They are both. They have both use value and exchange value at the same time. They have a dual soul, almost. And so I reread that as socio-natural. Great. I've avoided nature bifurcating by commodities being socio-natural. I wrote what is my favourite paper, but nobody else reads it or likes it, was on the tuning of musical instruments. And the Pythagoras, and whether, because some people go, oh, tuning and music's all in the ear, that's the human side, there's no such thing as music, it's just human perception, bad psychologists, and out there's just noise or resonances. And so I read the problem of tuning as one which is dealing with nature, because there are resonances in nature, but I brought the social in because actually equal temperament, which is the tuning system which we use in the West, is based on a mathematical compromise with the authority of hertz and frequencies to back it up. But it's both socio and natural, so I won't tell you the whole story. So that was my socio-natural, isn't that lovely? I've done tuning. And then more recently, it's just come out, is one on Alzheimer's disease. My father died of Alzheimer's, so I'm allowed to talk about it, in which I was critiquing the biomedical model, but also there's the sociology of Alzheimer's, but that reduces people to just their interpersonal relations with each other. So they say the sense of self. So I did a thing about whether people diagnosed with Alzheimer's lose their soul, but it's a Whiteheadian soul, And I think that I managed to think the two together. And so I'd written these 3 papers, and I feel like I've learned a vocabulary and a way of doing it. Nature is not bifurcated in any of these. And in a strange way, I seem to have missed the point. I don't know, I just worry that it's become too easy. It shouldn't be that easy to be able to say, oh, I can do Alzheimer's, I can do tuning, and I can do I can do commodity, I can do commodities, I can do capitalism and Alzheimer's. Amazing. So I'll put up some things. No, I really want you, I'm being honest, I think I've got a problem. Use that. And I want you to tell me that I'm wrong. Now, so what I've done, have we made things too easy for ourselves? Have I talked about that? Yes. Right, so Whitehead on nature. I'm going to put up 2 of my favourite quotations from Whitehead. My problem is...
Okay, we left.
I know. My worry is, what we do is you take Whitehead's, not his concept of nature in the concept of nature, but Whitehead's understanding of nature, and it's so generous and it's so beautiful, as put up here, that it makes it too easy for us as philosophers and scientists, because actually we're just going back to an old-fashioned notion of existence as some sort of total sort of thing. So when what I've done is I've reduced the social into this very generous notion of existence, but in doing so, all I've done is replicated the old philosophical notion of either nature, existence, cosmos, whatever it wants to be. I think that's my problem, what I've done. And the reason is because Whitehead gives us beautiful quotations, which I think we have to treat very carefully. So nature is plastic, although to every prevalent state of mind there corresponds I in nature setting its bounds to life. It is a false dichotomy to think of nature and man. Mankind is that factor in nature which exhibits in its most intense form the plasticity of nature, which is fantastic. Okay? And I agree with them. Abstraction expresses nature's mode of interaction and is not merely mental. When it abstracts, thought is merely conforming to nature, or rather it is exhibiting itself as an element in nature. Now, I love these. I think these are two of the best quotations, most helpful quotations. But the problem is, and I think what I've done, is if you just accept these, then you can talk about anything you want, as long as you learn this generous, open, plasticity, nature, abstraction, thinking, part of nature, you know, your question about how do you put mind in nature. It's almost like if you learn a trick and do it, then all I've done is gone back and with a sort of cleverer, more open, generous nature of nature, but it's not difficult enough for me. It's become too easy. Is this making any sense?
Yes.
You know, I've learned ways of saying things to get over a problem, but in doing so, I'm probably sketching over what's the real problem. I'm going to finish just with a little quotation, because one of the problems, I know you're probably not interested in Durkheim, and Latour, lovely man, doesn't read very closely. Mind you, nor do sociologists. They've misunderstood Durkheim. I've written a book on that, which nobody reads. I'm going to miss out Stengers because I've heard enough about it. Where's my Durkheim quote? It's at the bottom. Durkheim doesn't believe there's a separation between nature and society. He says the social realm is a natural realm, which differs from the other by a greater complexity. Durkheim doesn't believe in a division between nature and society. That's probably Levi-Strauss who did that, and Marcel Mauss, if you want a little bit of history. But actually, Durkheim says, it's really interesting, sociology can only be a science if the social is natural, because he was a natural scientist. If it was social in the way that we think of it in the 21st century, or Latour thinks we think of it, then it can't be sociology can't be a science, because it's not dealing with something which is natural. So I've put those together in order to upset myself and to say, am I being a Durkheimian when I'm reading Whitehead on nature? That's my problem.
Can you
I don't want
say
to be a
what a
Durkheimian.
Durkheimian is?
Sorry?
What is a Durkheimian?
Oh, well, I don't know. But it's just if you're in a sociology department, you don't want to be called a Durkheim. Well, some people do. They're weird.
That's all that matters.
Yeah, I'm going to miss that. I've finished.
Wow.
Plenty of time for a question. I wonder if I might suggest, if you have a new point, just to raise your hand, but if you want to be directly on point and very brief, just to maybe give me a little signal like this, and that way I can slip you right into the queue there. That's a brief point, on point. And then a new point is here.
I mean, I just have a question towards the last bit, just if you could explain that a bit more, because I mean, that quote is seems to really corroborate your point and your problem, but if the reason to say it that way is only to establish sociology as a natural science, then it doesn't convince me so much, because that could be rhetoric, you know, it could be like the rest of the book, which I haven't read, is implicitly or explicitly making those distinctions, but because he wants to establish sociology as a new science, he kind of says something like that. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on
Well, that's actually his last proper book, where he's given up a little bit on trying to establish it as a science. So it would be the rules of sociological method, where he's saying it's a science, it's a science. Here he's being more, I don't want to say idealist, but he's actually dealing with concepts and where concepts come from and the power of concepts. He thinks concepts are part of nature. But he's not worried about sociology being a science so much anymore. It's amazing.
Brian, Barbara, Erin?
I was just looking at the first quote, and the second phrase, to every prevalent state of mind there corresponds iron nature setting its bounds to life. So that seems to be putting a tendency toward the bifurcation of nature in nature, with I'm interpreting the bounds to life as the confirmation of the physical pole in the primary phases of an occasion. So it seems that there's a tension between the plasticity of the socio-natural and a tendency toward kind of more sort of toward a kind of inertness or mere transmission of past states that happens in the confirmation. So I'm wondering if your answer is already there in your quote.
Well, I think I'm reading it differently. I think that what he suggested with nature as plastic, we haven't realised the plasticity of nature, and just saying that the prevalent state, generally we tend to think of nature as being iron nature, which sets its bounds to life.
Oh, so you're thinking
that's all
that
I
as
would. That's how I've read it. It's just that's how we think. We've made the mistake of thinking that there's iron nature setting its bounds.
There isn't hope though.
Nature's plastic. Yeah, I've missed out the end of the sentence.
Okay.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Google knows.
So you're not reading that as talking about the confirmation of nature.
No,
It's sort of like contrary tensions, tendencies like in Bergson toward a certain, but along a big.
No, I mean I may be wrong. I could well be wrong. I often am.
Barbara, Erin?
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, very provoking, especially moving into social sciences. Like I like to think economy to be one, although economists tend not to think of themselves as social scientists. I don't have very clear thoughts. I'm just articulating them as we're doing here, which I like. So one point is that the bifurcation of nature is nature as bifurcated. So the natural realm of which Durkheim is talking about, that for me is a bifurcated nature, knowing a little bit of Durkheim. So the way of understanding nature in that way is really to laying down a bifurcated nature from a Whitehead perspective and reading the social, bringing the social back to the idea of a bifurcated nature. That's the first thought. The second thought is moving Whitehead as a basis for ecological economics, for example. The main point, what really changes is when talking about nature means talking about life, about living nature. And I don't see that much. Maybe, I don't know Durkheim well enough for that, but I don't see that much. It's the nature he's thinking about is really not considering life as a qualitatively different way of understanding, that changes completely our way of understanding what we call nature. That not many people may manage to do, like Whitehead, Burton, and others manage to do it. So that, in a way, understanding life means that our way of understanding what we call nature has to change radically, because life is not just, as I say, because it challenged the bifurcation. So I was wondering whether, again, to reframe it, the quote of Durkheim implies implicitly an understanding of nature as bifurcated and nature which is not yet including understanding of life.
I mean, I didn't come to a Whitehead conference to defend Durkheim, but
No.
I'm not sure where the bifurcation is. If you've studied Durkheim, you've probably been taught that it's bifurcated. So there's nature and society, there's nature and the social,
No, the
but it's not.
bifurcation is not between nature and society, but the understanding of nature that Durkheim brings forward.
Well, no, there are three realms in Durkheim which have equal weight depending. So there's the matter that you were talking about, which appears inert. There's the organic psycho. There's the organic realm, and then there's the social realm. So he would allow for there being life. It's just he's introducing in the social aspect of existence. He has fantastic things to say about matter. He thinks it's more mobile and that constraint. He thinks a constraint, which is an important part of what he understands by the social psychological, so social constraint, etc., which affects us and how we behave. He says that must be natural, and it must be in nature, and it must be in matter. So the notion of force and constraint must be there in molecules and things, otherwise it couldn't be in the human realm. So in a weird way, he just doesn't let it bifurcate at all. But I'm not coming to defend him, I'm coming to attack myself.
Got Erin and Clara, did you want to have on point or new point?
She doesn't know yet.
I don't know the difference.
Would you want to have a short moment now or a longer moment after Erin?
Yeah, I'll go
Very good.
So, you know that part, thank you, it's fantastic. You know that part of Function of Reason where, I wish I could quote it perfectly, but sort of the big downfall of man is a good methodology? I always
Yeah.
reread that part.
Yeah.
So, and I think it really touches on what you're doing. And so I sympathize very strongly with you on this. And I think this is a problem that many of us, that has kept many of us who are strong and close readers of Deleuze and Guattari away from anything that's organized about Deleuze and Guattari, right? So the cottage industry around Deleuze and Guattari is just dreadful because it becomes a kind of superficial speak of deterritorialization. You could fall asleep and wake up and, the next time it's just terrible. So I really, really share this with you and I wish I knew more about Durkheim because our son is in a sociology department and he's just written a paper on Taald which got a really bad mark because they said, he had to write on Durkheim. So, but this is what I'm thinking. So it's probably as obvious around the SenseLab. Many of us don't come to philosophy many of us come through philosophy through another practice. And I think thinking is also another practice. I think all of us come through philosophy through a kind of engagement that is material. And then it happens to us in different ways. In my own case, it almost always happens out of the studio. So I don't go into the studio with philosophy. I come out of the studio with a need to work something through. And that's why I and several other people call it speculative pragmatism. And so I think that for me, this question is what can it do, much more than what can it say, and so I've really appreciated over the 3 days or 2 days your emphasis on being careful with the vocabulary. But I've also, and I think this really sinks in with that. I'm also not convinced that we have to police our vocabulary. I think we have to be careful about what we do, and the question then becomes, what are the conditions under which we rehumanize the project of Whitehead? Because in the moment we rehumanize it, in the moment it becomes our problem again. We've rebifurcated. And it doesn't matter how well we speak about the bifurcation of nature then, if it's on us again. And so it seems to me that the question you're asking has to be asked every single day. Anyway, so I just really appreciate it. Did that help you?
Yes. The first thing is that I also wanted to thank you because I've been trying to write this thing about the separation of the body and space. Like I have a problem with people saying your body enters a space. It's just like no. But then it's very easy to explain if I use one of those quotes. And so I tried to write the paper and I just write that quote and it's like it's there. What else is there to explain? Which is a lot as well, but I know that there's a complexity that also is willing to be composed around that question. So I understand the problem. But at the same time, there's two things that I wanted to say. The first one is if this has been simplified to us by Whitehead in that very with all that complexity arriving to those crystallizations that are just kind of very clear and simple. Yet, when he says in Nature and Life, how we come to these expressions of the sun is coming out, oh, now the sun is coming out. And so common sense expressions are embedded all along with the bifurcation. So how come, if it's so easy, still in a majority of people's lives, it's really not a given. The contrary is done and expressed over and over and over again. So that's the first thing, because it's like, well, yeah, but the problem is all for you because maybe some of us are thinkers and we can get to those places, but I don't know, when it's pervasive in a majority that bifurcation is there all the time. It's just like, how come? You know, in Nature and Life, Whitehead is talking about like, come on guys, like science already found the plasticity, and yet we're still with the science of a kind of beginning of science. So what's going on there? So I think that's also Whitehead's question. Like if this is like this, how come this is still happening? And the second thing is that for me, I always think that if nature is non-deprecated, what constitutes difference then? Because there seems to be this complexity of, okay, but then there's something there to understand because it's not everything the same. There's no bifurcation, but there's still differentiation, not necessarily separation. So what's the difference between separating or differentiating? So that's one of the things. And what I was thinking when I think this question is, then it's a question of how it happens. So what I think that easiness of what you're saying is that you are really just trying to explain something. And when we explain something, it's really, I don't know, there's something about the explanatory that it's kind of flat. And maybe that's the easiness. But when you go into the how, which is different than the explanatory, because you're trying to be operative. You know, and it's very funny that you mentioned this of like your father dying of Alzheimer's, my father died of ALS, and I wrote a letter to him, and I was trying to say something to him, but I'm not trying to explain to him that he's going to die very soon. I'm trying to make something with this letter for something that I don't know. I'm trying to build a relation, and I'm trying to shift. I'm trying to craft some kind of pathways for a differential way of dealing with this together. So it makes something, it does something. And that was important. And it was important that I stayed far away from explaining. So maybe there's something about that. What's the quality of the papers that we're writing? Are they for explaining something? Well, we've been explained over and over, but what are they doing? So I guess this is just an invitation for a politics of how, instead of a politics of what.
We have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, and I'm not going to, because I said I've got a problem and I want to hear from people, so I'm not going to, I can give you another quotation, you probably know it already. Sorry, I could give you another quotation, but you probably know it already, which is, no one says, here I am and I brought my body with me. I think, is that in Modes of Thought?
That's in Modes of Thought.
Yeah.
Melanie and Roland, and that's probably all we'll have time for.
I can also withdraw.
You don't need to withdraw.
I mean, I just found it interesting that because my experience with the bifurcation of nature, which has been so crucial for me, is actually totally the opposite. Like the more I think about it, the more complicated it gets for me, and I wonder. Sorry. I wonder why that is. As I mean, in Germany, you have this expression: you don't see the forest because there's so many. In Wald vor lauter Bäumen, ich sehe there's so many trees. Or if there's a real problem in this complication, but I think maybe one way is the complication for me lies in the methodology and not in like. I can easily discern it in text, and like if I work with text, I can say, okay, well, here's the bifurcation of nature. But to put it into practice in terms of a different methodology, for me, it's not that easy. Or also bringing in examples, which I've been working with students, is super interesting, but I have like just to share that.
Yeah, it shouldn't be easy. This is why it's personal, my problem, because I've just developed almost a groove of thought of allowing myself to think it's easy. So, and Didier Debes has written a great book, his new one, which
But
deals
maybe
with.
he makes it easy at the end.
Do you think he makes it easy at the end? But he deals with bifurcation in a really interesting way in the early chapters about But it's not an ontological problem, it's one which comes from other processes. But so no, it's not easy, but it's become easy for me. It's not, sorry? Okay.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm point. Okay, and then we'll be done.
I'm suspicious of the suspicion of easiness. I would say maybe superficial. That's the problem. I don't see the valorization of difficulty as worthwhile. It just doesn't seem accurate to me. Is it superficiality? That's the problem. And is easiness a shorthand? Because, you know, as has been said, the easiness could be because you're at the beginning of the project. That, you know, and the difficulty comes from committing to it as a lifelong endeavor, perhaps. But if
No, I'm happy to take that.
if superficiality is the problem, then that's a different problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you are yourself the happy bifurcation. I'm happy to accept this easiness with you, right? The way you present it. So here's a thought. I'm still hung up with these quotes and the terminology as you were, Brian. So I think what happens in these two quotes of Whitehead is the use of abstraction. It's a double use that kind of allows for this bifurcation, but doesn't necessitate it. By using it as a restraint already in nature, right? The non-plasticity, and also in mind. So there's the kind of, with logic, it comes together with mathematics maybe. And then there's the use of imagination, using abstraction as imagination, or as aesthetics, as Whitehead sometimes kind of sets them apart. And they go finally back, I think, if you go to his category of explanation, it goes back to this absolute differentiation between potential and actual. And there it lies, and you can't go further and can't say anything, you know, how are they related? Why do we begin with them? And then from there it develops abstraction in both directions of plasticity and poetics even, right? Fifth chapter of Science and Modern World, and mathematics on the other hand, and logic. And they seem to bifurcate all the time, but at the same time, they are not. Right? And it's exactly your problem. I don't know whether there is a solution to it, except you can really explain the difference between actuality and potential. And I think I haven't seen anybody.
Thank you.
Michael, do you have any last thoughts?
No, I came to listen, so that's it.
Our last presenter this morning is James Burton, who will be presenting Ecological Salvation.
Hi. So I want to start with not an excuse, more a disclaimer that because I'm going to talk about salvation and God to some extent, in this context I want to say that I'm not a theologian, and I know that's sometimes annoying when people do that because it sounds like an excuse for any naivety you find in what they then say, but I'm more saying it to make sure you're aware of my naivety, because in case I don't sound naive enough, I want to let you know that there might be some obvious things that would really help with my knot that I wouldn't have noticed because, you know, I haven't studied the history of theology. So, let me tie my knot and then see what you can do with it. So the first strand comes from my interest in thinking ecology and thinking ecology in post-natural ways, to give it one of its terms, as implicating what used to be called the natural with the technological, the cultural, the social kind of things that would be beyond, in mixed terms, like a Latourian separation. And it seems to me that Whitehead's speculative philosophy or philosophy of organism offers an extremely valuable resource for thinking, addressing the ecological in this way, given the radical relationality that it brings, the usage of actual occasions which allows a kind of ecological thinking about ecology that I think is necessary to the thinking of ecology as post-natural, as a condition in which the technical, social, cultural, psychological, conceptual, political are all, how does he put it, on the same level. The final facts are all alike actual entities, and these actual entities are drops of experience, complex and interdependent. So it's an ecological conception of which in itself, which I think is necessary to thinking ecology in this context. In this way, anticipating a Deleuzian plane of immanence, or Guattari's three ecologies, or even Simondon individuation, and contemporary thought on post-natural ecologies. But here's the second strand. So Whitehead's great for thinking ecology ecologically, but his speculative philosophy seems to leave one obstacle to one particular aspect of thinking ecology, which is that despite this expansion of what we term ecology in certain theoretical and conceptual contexts, the destruction of planetary life, or its decimation, remains a primary concern for many people involved in this kind of discussion. And increasingly seems like, it's past a point of no return. It's an increasing, let's say, intuitive proposition that some kind of ecological collapse and destruction of planetary life on a massive scale is almost unavoidable. Right? Whether you say that's because we've passed a certain point climatologically, or whether you say it's because the will to reverse the process that are leading to that point of no return seems to be just so far beyond our access, or it's so far lacking, that there doesn't seem to be a way socially to intervene effectively. Whatever the case, whatever the reasons for this, it's a common sort of actuality of experience that we're at this point, which means that any kind of reversal of that situation would have to be experienced as somehow on the level of something like salvation, something like a transcendent occasion, because it would change something that seems almost impossible to change. And so Whitehead on this point seems to leave us a gap, because he has God, and he has a God that saves, as we know, and as probably many people here know better than me. And this is integral to his metaphysics, and he takes many steps in the elaboration of God even, which would be valuable and perhaps necessary for this task of thinking ecologically about ecology that I'm talking about, effectively what we might call an immanentizing of God. So when he criticizes theistic philosophy, as he puts it, for personified versions of God, or for an imperialist God, or in Christianity and Islam, he says, the doctrine of an aboriginal, eminently real, transcendent creator at whose fiat the world came into being and whose imposed will it obeys. So he criticizes all that and moves in the direction of a God corresponding to a fundamental creativity, not the act of creation, but a process of creativity and of tenderness and love that is quiet and slow, and I'm paraphrasing rather than quoting at that point. Okay. So that's all great, but the problem is, and this God does save, Whitehead's God, but the problem is it seems to save only from ultimate evil, right? The ultimate evil, which is deeper than any specific evil, that's a quotation from Process and Reality, the famous final part, and consists in, quote, the fact that the past fades, that time is a perpetual perishing, unquote. So Whitehead's God saves by this ultimate evil only by virtue of what Brianne yesterday analogized to a virtual hard drive, right? On the one hand, you have the primordial side of God, which is this creativity. On the other side, you have this consequent nature of God, which is the one that saves. So the primordial side is the principle of concretion, which sort of gives rise to the actual world and is the creative process that continues its creative advance. On the other hand, the consequent side is the determined, everlasting, fully actual and conscious side, that saves by reincorporating all the actualities that perish in this kind of virtual hard drive, which I really like as an analogy for that. So to come to my proposition then, given that Whitehead is so valuable for the way I would say we ought to think about ecology in this kind of immanent way, can we conceive of an occasion or an experience of salvation that would be adequate to the demands of this Whiteheadian ontology, and that would nevertheless allow for the saving of some actual entities, or the staving off of the perishing of some actual entities, such as living beings or planetary life, including ourselves. And here, I'm definitely conscious of the danger of how are we going to deal with rehumanizing Whitehead. How do we do that, and what's it involve? So, in other words, what are the possibilities of an immanent salvation that would still retain the intimations of transcendence at the level of experience that would be necessary for thinking or feeling a way out of a seemingly inescapable predicament? And I want to mention just that previously, when I've tried to address this broad question, I've done it through using Bergson's conception of fabulation. But that also leads to a series of knots, which I'll just briefly summarize, because I've still got probably plenty of time. Excellent. Right? So to put it briefly, the way of using fabulation to address this for me is to say, okay, we invent the savior figures we need. But this leads you into a series of paradoxes and dangers. For one thing, you then say, well, don't all the worst versions of religion and gods and so on arise from fabulations just as much as the smaller ones? In Lyotard's terms, the petit récit and the grand narratives both come from fabulating at some point, from inventing and creating the schemas, the imaginaries, the images that you need to justify your conception of the world, or to intervene in the world and make it differently. And then on a more pragmatic scale, doesn't the notion of inventing your own savior, if it's going to be at all effective in having any saving potential, doesn't this require, at some level, obscuring this act of self-creation? So doesn't it require some kind of amnesia? And how can you have a deliberately induced amnesia, apart from taking a pill or something? Well, maybe that is the way. So how can you decide consciously to pursue this path in a sort of deliberate sense? How can you create something and induce a forgetting of the creation? And then another of the dangers is don't most of the worst tyrants that we've seen have exactly, and the great mystics, have exactly this capacity to have visions, to construct something that functions as their kind of their savior figure or their guiding force, but then to forget that they've created it and to sort of impose it upon the rest of the world. And over the past day or so, this is one of the things that's further tying me up in knots with my already knotted question, is that I've already got several clues to ways of thinking this through, which are already great, and I'm grateful for. One from Brianne's approach yesterday to expression, where I think it gives me the sense that one way of fabulating your figure of salvation, which doesn't necessarily have to be an anthropomorphized salvation figure, would be a kind of expression that would have a sort of virtual form with regard to specific evil, a sort of equivalent of Whitehead's consequent God, what that does with regard to all perishing, to the ultimate evil, to try and make a virtual version of that with regard to specific evils. And so a second clue might be that then what's needed in that task of fabulating your own savior figures or figures of salvation is that they must also continue to perish, that they must be subject to the specific evil of perishing, in order that you don't make them into tyrannical or dominant imperialist religious figures. And And so maybe the clue is that I've been looking for how to have a Whiteheadian salvation that stops the perishing of actual entities, and but maybe my problem has been that I don't want that notion of salvation itself to perish. Maybe it should continue to perish and keep being reinvented and remade. So I'll stop there because that's already plenty of knotty tangles.
About 11 minutes for questions so that we can have a little bit of a break. So the same thing, if you've got something directly on point that's short, just give this motion and I'll be scanning for you. Who'd like to start? Directly on point, Aaron starts.
Well, the first one is that I couldn't really understand the concept of salvation until the end, which is a kind of the salvation from perishing, you mean? I guess. I don't know. Because I just kept writing, why would you need salvation or salvation from what? But now I think I understood in the end. And then I wonder if the concept of objective immortality would be a way of thinking that. And also the way that Whitehead talks about the solidarity for the world of the cultural experience. So when it's perishing, it's not perishing, it's just becoming world.
Yeah, but in a way that's my problem. That's good if you're absolutely certain that there's nothing you can do, that you're facing destruction or death or perishing of the thing you want to not perish. But if you set as your baseline a little bit higher than that and say, I want to stop ecological collapse, or I want to stop the death of millions of people or animals or other entities, then that's not enough. That's a great sort of way to acquiesce and to come to terms with the perishing. But it's not good if I say, well, no, I'm not going to rest on that. I'm not happy with that. I want to do something. I want to change something with it, and not accept some of this perishing.
Thank you. I don't think we can do this in 11 minutes.
You can't save me. Or else.
Two thoughts, and really, I'll be thinking about this for a long time. Fabulation is also a place that I've been thinking through a lot. And I wonder whether, for me at least, the way that it turns with Artaud in Cinema 2 is really important in relation to the powers of the false. So for me, I make a really big difference between minor gestures and grand gestures. And the example that is on my mind right now is the reconciliation in the Canadian context for the First Nations people. Right. So you could talk, if you talked a little bit closer, I think, to the way you were using fabulation, of two kinds of fabulation. The state-based fabulation of the apology, which has to sort of invent a past, to invent a future in order never to deal with what's really happening, which is to say, to silence First Nations by apologizing to them and creating a context through which people can't respond. The only way they can respond is through their trauma, because all that ever happens is another accounting of the trauma of residential school. But that's not what happened in Canada. What happened was Idle No More. And Idle No More was not the beginning of what was happening. It was the making, it was sort of the actual occasion of so many decades of work. And so for me, Idle No More is a kind of power of the false. It's another kind of fabulation that carries that power for transformation with it and refutes any kind of homogeneous retelling of itself. It holds on to that contrast or to the differential. So that's one way I was thinking it. And so coming back to your question, what worries me about what your question is, and I think it's exactly what worries you as well, is that if it becomes this kind of homogeneous wholeness, we're right back to totalitarianism. So is there a way I don't say this with any confidence, except that it's the only way I can think it, is there a way to develop attentiveness to the minor gestures which are not ours to make? So the way that I define a minor gesture, I can't make it. There's an attunement to it. So a minor gesture, one of the ways in which I talk about it would be the turning of the leaves in the fall in a northern country. You can't find it. You can't, no matter how hard I've tried my whole life to see the day when the leaves turn, you can't see it. But the quality of life is completely changed by it. So what are these ways of living that are with us, amongst us, which alter our capacity to be in the world? And how does the power of the falls connect to that? That's the only thing I can think of. So it doesn't. So in the way that I understand Whitehead's God is creativity, this has a lot of power. But again, I'm just trying to learn the process theology. It's very new to me. But yeah. So anyway.
That's great. But yeah, because but it's possible that one of my problems has been thinking about this act of fabulating as doing something that you're completely responsible for, and then how to experience it as something coming from outside. But maybe it is, like, to the extent that you consider yourself separated from the outside, it is literally coming from outside. Like,
Exactly.
it's coming from, and that's a great way to think about how that works with these minor gestures. Thank you. Yeah, brilliant.
Roland in the queue. Maybe reserving the right to be on point after Roland.
Yeah, like it's too many things that fire in my head by every sentence you say, and I don't know how to organize that right now. And I think if I reduce Whitehead's God to the two notions of creativity and relativity, or relationality in some way, so just as a notion for now, what happens? So there's this quote of Whitehead where he says about every event, and therefore every society too, in some way, introduces more or less of that final side of existence, which is for him the kind of the culmination of creativity and relationality, or God. And so there's no way beyond that, meaning the perishing is a condition for the introduction of that final side, or the furthering of its going down. And therefore this is part of the ecological mechanism, if you want, not mechanism, but yeah, unavoidability of connectivity is, it cannot just be changed like this. It's that it's only micro introductions, or the failure to introduce these finer elements that makes it that makes a difference. But interestingly, on a macro level, Whitehead had this vision beyond, like what he calls like the consequent natures being the kingdom of God and so on, so beyond this world in some way, and the world of perpetual perishing as it is now for us. He says in this passage, I think it's 346 in Plus Reality, he talks about there's no metaphysical necessity that there could not be a realm, a universe, and he says that just like that, in which there would be novelty without perishing. So what is that? No, it's not the kingdom of God, it's not in God's consummate nature, it's not this universe, but it's another, like a cosmic epoch. So there's a sense for him that there could be different cosmic epochs in which things could be very different, not just regarding natural laws, but also how micro events or organizing societies behave in some way that allows for a character to develop in this universe that would be different. I think we can imagine that, we can fabulate that and make it part of our activation in the knowledge that we will not change it. It's this kind of hope in the face of no hope.
Right, yeah.
That kind of remains.
Yeah.
Here at this point. And the last point, when Whitehead introduces savior figures, if he ever does, he mentions them precisely at the point of God-forsakenness.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it's not so. All they can do is, like the body, to amplify these two elements of creativity and relationality, and allow for these micro kind of activations to happen. And therefore they perish, and they did.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, in a way, it's not It's not the strongest religious believers or the strongest atheists who need saving, it's the people in between, right? Like if you really firmly commit to a certain religious belief, you're already saved, and this is why you're saved from ultimate evil. But I mean, there's actually like a study called Are There Atheists in Foxholes? Based on that, old saying, well, not old, it's the Second World War, isn't it? There are no atheists in foxholes, as in everyone turns to God when they're being shot at. Actually, there are plenty of atheists in foxholes. It's people with extreme beliefs either way have less fear of death, but people without a strong atheism or a strong, according to cognitive studies, it's us in the middle who are in need of salvation.
We just have two on points on the first one. I just wanted to say one thing, that I found the language of God really disconcerting when I first, and I didn't want to have to deal with the concept of God in Whitehead, and I think for years I fought against it. And I just want, probably many of you already know this, but in Adventures of Ideas, he changes that language to the receptacle, to the Khora, K-H-O-R-A, which he draws from Plato, to the foster mother of all becoming, moving it, I think, to a philosophical realm, if that's a way that would enable you to engage it. But it is a foster mother of becoming, right? It is meant to fold into the activation. It is meant to inform a future of less loss. And it itself doesn't change because its content, this receptacle's content, is only the content of everything that happens. So in a sense, it's always emptied of its own stagnation, even as it can be folded into a real incarnation or a materializing and actualizing. And last on point, Catherine.
I'm just going to land on a point and feel it turn into a black hole. So it's have to say something, sort of channeling my Christian theologian persona, or else I shouldn't have paid for the plane fare. And I think I can address this in my apocalypse talk later today. But I think it's fabulous that you took up this question, and I think it's very risky to do so, especially probably in this context, but it would be in a more densely theological context just as risky. So bravo, and I'm really grateful that you're raising this question of our need for salvation from ecological self-destruction. This is intense, real, and we mostly just don't want to talk about it, and we're taking part in a form of mild denialism that's not explicit and honest like that of Trumpism. Just this the notion of salvation in Whitehead does help me to save class after class of students coming out, in my intro to theology class, students coming out of quite traditional Christian theologies and who will go back to be ministers in the inner city, or one of them has gone back to the second time to work with the clergy at Standing Rock, those sort of Christians. But it saves them from the notion that God is going to step in and in any sense save us from our deeds in the world. I mean, they like the consequent nature in some sense of some kind of eternal reverberation of the meaningfulness of our lives. That's cool. But the process theology very sharply offers an alternative that they find often that they can teach and preach to the notion of divine salvation, that it's responsible for so much of the deep irresponsibility of Western civilization. And the only other thing I'll say is salvation coming from salvus, healing, but which is a little gentler, a little more persuasive, a little less coercive than salvation as intervention. And that salve also related, of course, to Meshiach, the ancient sense of the Messiah, which is the anointing, again, oil, pleasurable, healing, oil, anointing for the task, which is hard, which is political, and then the notion of the Meshiach, the Messiah, coming up in Walter Benjamin's Jewish Marxism. In the first half of the 20th century, the weak the weak messianic force, which actually was backwards, one looks forward. I think these are mediations that perhaps help some regime.
That's a lot of really.
We're at time, so let's thank James.